Yeah, that's what I really like about your work is that you give definite answers, particularly about regarding the book of Revelation, which I had studied for, 15 years. And when I read Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, it all made perfect sense. In fact, really the entire New
Yeah.
Testament makes perfect sense after reading that book, even though your magnum opus, your main work is Caesar's Messiah. I really like that second work, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, because it really
Well,
just
because
comes
Paul
together.
is such a huge question mark for Christianity,
Hmm.
and the first thing that kind of criticism of Caesar's Messiah was again sort of is the same kind of misapplication of logic or logically contradictory kind of critiques where they would go, well, um, the Flavians couldn't have written or invented Jesus because Paul existed before the Flavians. You see,
Hmm.
this was the
Hmm.
idea they had,
Hmm.
and so they really, even though Jesus was sort of hanging by a thread, and my analysis seemed pretty coherent, and that looked like Jesus was basically an invented character. That couldn't quite be true because Paul talked about Jesus, and so Paul was this kind of bulwark or basis for evidence of belief in Jesus. But then in Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, I brought out the Pauline typology, and I just said, nah, what Paul is, it's Domitian's Jesus. Um, the the one of the problems with Caesar's Messiah is that it focuses on a really narrow part of the Christian literature, just the synoptic gospels, really,
Hmm.
and some of the Gospel of John, but it uses the synoptic gospels, which were basically written for this purpose. It uses the synoptic gospels to show the linkage between the Flavian military campaign and the story of Jesus.
Hmm.
So this is I feel my explanation is coherent and virtually exhaustive for the synoptic gospels. But then bear in mind that between the time that the Flavians produce the gospel, say between 90 and 100, between then and when the canonical gospels were really ossified by Constantine or whoever created
Hmm.
Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, the codexes, the ancient codexes that are at the beginning of the fourth century. There's this like 200-year period. And so from the point that the synoptics were written until the final brushstroke was added to the, what becomes the modern New Testament, there were just dozens of emperors, and they had access to the literature clearly, and they could fiddle with it in any way they wanted in order perhaps to create a little bit of legacy for themselves. I would argue that Timothy, for example, in the letters of Timothy are from Trajan and are actually
Hmm.
sort of one of the last pieces of the literature. I don't think Constantine put anything into it that I can detect, but I do think that the literature was continuing to be manipulated and developed as a legacy piece, even up to the end of Trajan. Um, so you have this period where the literature comes into existence in around say 90, and then is finally brought to history in the beginning of the fourth century.
Hmm.
And in between, there's just lots of different things that can happen to it. And I think that with Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, I tried to show that the the Caesars that were subsequent also had some hand in the literature. They didn't just leave it alone and as they received it, they manipulated it. And
Hmm.
so you end up with finally with a document that has a lot of different authors. Um, but having said this, you can still see the core, kind of typology is linking into the Flavians. And the book of Revelation, which is, I mean, been such a puzzle for Christianity. There's
Hmm.
been like the synoptic problem, there have been like dozens of explanations of who wrote it and
Mm-hmm.
what even the words mean. There's different explanations as to, is it Rome they're talking about, or
Mm-hmm.
some kind of vision of the future, different ideas of the Book of Revelation. But I show that it's really written as a kind of humorous depiction of the god Domitian. Domitian, after he became Caesar, I think looked at the Synoptic Gospels and felt that he would like to have the same kind of legacy. And so he was able to produce his character Paul and the Book of Revelation, and then he used Suetonius as his Josephus. So you end up with a completely distinct system of typology from the synoptics, and it's different in its flavor. The synoptics are really about war. It's a military campaign that Jesus is basically typologically prefiguring. So it has kind of a coherence because it's a real process that's occurring, that Jesus is linking to a historical, natural process of this military campaign. Well, with Domitian, you don't have that. I mean, Domitian is in Rome, he's Caesar, and he appears to be mentally ill, from what I can gather. So you end up with crazy literature like the Book of Revelation, which um, has not so much the conclusion of a military campaign, but just the creation of humor. If you've read Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, I point out that a lot of the passages in Revelation and in Paul are really just this vicious humor that Domitian evidently liked to engage in. And it's a kind of humor that is so vulgar that, I mean, I just don't think most normal people would find this stuff funny,
Mm-hmm.
but evidently Domitian did. So I like to, you know, um, uh, sort of make sure that when I'm talking to someone about the theory, that they have a grounding in Caesar's Messiah before we go into Shakespeare, because the author of Revelation and the letters of Paul, and these were being produced, probably in the late 90s, right? This was when Domitian had control and was cranking this stuff out. The authors were really writing it as an add-on to the synoptics. So the authors are writing it for people who are aware of the Jesus Titus typology. This is critical for the what they're producing. You see, they are adding on to that typology. That was what Domitian was trying to do with Paul and with Revelation. So it's for me to try to explain this to someone who hasn't read the Titus typology and doesn't understand it is impossible. So this is why I brought them out in two different books, and then it was also compounded because I also was aware of that the works of Shakespeare had been developed as kind of a response to the humor and the Caesar humor in the New Testament. And so it's just an enormous lump of, kind of intellectual process that a reader has to go through. It's torturous, I presume, to go through from Caesar's Messiah and look at this complicated typologic system, and then go into Paul and Domitian's piece, and then from there to go to Shakespeare, where you have a kind of response, humorous response to all this. It's just such a huge transition. I'm always amazed when I meet people who have actually gone through it. So
Mm-hmm.
they're to be congratulated for the patience, to
Mm-hmm.
actually go through all that whole lengthy process. But anyway.